Excuse me. Next up is Dr. Tom Morgan. Tom is a biopsychologist and cultural evolutionary scientist here, again, in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change and the Institute of Human Origins. His research combines formal theory and psychological experimentation to explore the reciprocal relationships between human evolution, cognition, and culture. Basically, how our minds shape cultural change, how the human lineage evolved to have complex culture, and how culture shaped and continues to shape the genetic evolution of our species. So more genetics. Dr. Morgan worked in biology and psychology departments before joining the Institute of Human Origins in 2016. Welcome, Dr. Tom Morgan.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Volume good? Good. Okay, so I promise I'm going to get to some of the science that I do eventually, but because what I do is maybe not the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of human origins science, I'm going to start with a historical digression. I wish I could call it brief, but lock the doors, here we go. Okay, so we're going to start 170 years ago. Here's the middle-aged Charles Darwin wearing lots of tartan. And this is 1854, shortly before he publishes The Origin of the Species, his famous book that sets out evolution by natural selection. And at this point, he had been sitting on this idea probably for about 10 to 15 years, but he had been progressively working to accumulate more and more evidence to try and persuade his future readership that his theory was right? Other people had tried before, and none of them had achieved scientific success. So you might think that the evidence that he would use to prove his theory comes from the fossil record, right? Maybe he would look to transitional forms like Archaeopteryx, which is transitional between the dinosaurs and birds. Maybe like Lucy, transitional between apes and humans. Or maybe like Acanthostega, which is transitional between aquatic vertebrates and land vertebrates. So Acanthostega lived in the water, but if you look closely at its limbs, they're very terrestrial looking, aside from the fact that it has 7 fingers. But Darwin could not do this because none of these were available at the time, right? So Acanthostega was discovered in the late 1980s by the paleontologist Jennifer Clack, so gone. As we know, Lucy was discovered 50 years ago, so gone. And Archaeopteryx was actually discovered in Darwin's lifetime, but was not available to him then. So that one was gone too, at least while he was writing The Origin of Species. So what did Darwin do? He sought out other kinds of evidence. And in particular, he relied on biogeography. So he famously traveled around the world on the Beagle voyage and recorded what he saw about the distributions of species in different places. And this was the kind of evidence he provided. So the famous example is what we now call Darwin's finches. So in the Galapagos, an archipelago of multiple islands, he noticed that across the islands, there were these similar varieties of finch, but they all seemed to be adapted to the local conditions on each island, right? So some of the islands were dry with tough plants, and the finches there had these big chunky beaks. Other islands were maybe more pleasant to live at, and so the finches there had more delicate beaks. And so Darwin collected many cases like these and then made the argument that, isn't this just like some ancestral finch species was blown to these islands, and then it radiated and adapted to the local conditions on each island. This is actually Darwin slightly rewriting history, because we know from his diaries that when he got to the Galapagos, he thought these birds were so different that they were not particularly related to each other at all. He didn't bother to record which islands he found them on. And so it was only a decade later, working with an ornithologist, that he kind of pieced this together and realized it was actually a great example of what he was talking about. So 1859, a few years after that photo, he publishes his book, and it is very well received, persuades a lot of people of evolution, but what it does not do is persuade people in a widespread fashion of the truth of natural selection. And in fact, what we see is the next 15 years, a lot of people spend a lot of effort thinking about natural selection, but by the end of Darwin's life, towards the end of the 19th century, natural selection is kind of on the way out. And in 1903, to kind of crystallize this, we see the publication of this book, At the Deathbed of Darwinism. This is the only picture of the first issue I can find. It's got the kind of the bloody streak on the front. So, Darwinism's, it's not just on its deathbed, it's been murdered. And this is kind of representative of a lot of the thinking going on in the very early 20th century. So here's the opening quote from the preface, which is that recent scientific literature dealing with evolution may fairly be characterized as distinctly and prevailingly unfavorable to the Darwinian theory of natural selection. In the series of chapters herewith offered, Dr. Dennett has brought together testimonies which leave no room for doubt about the decadence of the Darwinian theory. So I'm not sure what decadence really means in this context, but it's obviously not good. Okay, so that was, I guess now this brings up to 1903, about 120 years ago. But we know that this is a blip, right? This is a period now called the eclipse of Darwinism, where Darwinism briefly is out of favor, and eventually it gets rescued. So how is it rescued? And the answer is by, yes, there is an increasingly complete fossil record and more biogeographic data, but in addition, we get even more different kinds of data that Darwin himself hadn't conceived of during his lifetime. So one example, this is William Bateson, this is the happiest looking picture I can find of him, who seems to have not been a very jolly character. So he started off studying sea acorns to try and piece together the deep evolutionary relationships between vertebrates and invertebrates. And he gives up because he thinks it's just a waste of time. We're not going to solve it. So instead, he goes off, travels the world, trying to study the nuts and bolts of evolution in the field. And in particular, he's interested in variation. So he travels around and collects endless examples of variations in wild species. And this is one of the ones he documents, mutation in the fly, where the antennae, which on the right are quite modest, there's a mutation that turns them into kind of miniature limbs, which is what's on the left. So he compiled all these examples of mutations. He coined the term genetics. And you might think that this would help Darwin, because one thing it did do was Bateson worked very hard to disprove lots of the rival theories to natural selection, stuff that we don't necessarily know about today, like neo-Lamarckianism and orthogenesis. So it does sort of clear the field a bit. But Bateson was opposed to natural selection, and he thought mutations was all you need, right? Evolution was just mutations appearing. Whichever mutations appeared, that's what determined what would happen. But then, in the next couple of decades, there was the development of just abstract mathematical theory by guys like this, Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane on the right, and Sewell Wright in the middle. They're all kind of, visionary, eccentric geniuses and deeply awful characters, some of them. But what they do is they just use, chalk and a blackboard to show that actually the discoveries of Bateson about mutations, which can be treated mathematically, can actually be united with natural selection pretty effectively. And because the discoveries of people like Bateson had winnowed the field of rival theories, there's now this union of genetics and natural selection as a viable evolutionary theory. One other kind of evidence that I want to talk about, which is going a couple of decades back in time, is experimental evolution. So this is the Reverend William Dallinger on the left, and I guess in his spare time, he built these rather peculiar devices that he called incubators. And within them, he had little vats of bacteria, and they were sitting in a water bath, and the water bath had a heating element. And he would, experiment on his bacteria by changing the temperature of the water bath they were kept in. And he could vary it from 60 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, so getting really hot. And, unsurprisingly, he noticed that if he started it cool and then just, ramped it up to maximum temperature pretty much immediately, all the bacteria would die. They get cooked. But if he did that very slowly, the bacteria would not die. They would survive, reproduce, and eventually he had these happy little colonies of bacteria living in a 160-degree water bath. If at that point he turned the water bath off and let it cool back down to room temperature, all the bacteria would die. So he concluded that he had been able to observe the evolution via natural selection of bacteria to adapt to high temperature environments, right? And so he did a whole bunch of experiments like this, where he could experimentally observe natural selection in the lab. And these sorts of experiments have continued today, right? People still do this kind of experimental evolutionary work. Okay, so going back to Darwin, here he is as a somber old man. He didn't get to see any of this, right? He died during the eclipse when his theory was, kind of on the out. But after his death, his theory would eventually be resurrected, and it wasn't just through the fossil record and his biogeography, but also these other contributions from lab work, from mathematics, from experimental studies. Okay, so what about human evolution then? Okay, so for humans, the problem is a little more complicated, and I like this quote. So this is Thomas Hunt Morgan, no relation to me, and he's forever undermining my search engine optimization, because he is far more famous, the first American Nobel Prize winner, father of classical genetics, all that sort of stuff. But even though he was totally instrumental to the development of genetics as we know it, he recognized that in humans, there are additional wrinkles to the evolutionary story. So here's a quote from him. There are in man two processes of inheritance, one through the physical continuity of the germ cells, and that means genetic inheritance, and the other through the transmission of the experiences of one generation to the next by means of example or by spoken and written language. And so by that, he means when I talk about culture, that's what he's talking about. Okay, so then, if we're trying to understand the evolution of our species, using Lucy as a visual metaphor, then the problem is double what people like Bateson and the early population geneticists were thinking about, in that it's a story both of genetic evolution, so we need to understand mutation, DNA, inheritance, all that sort of stuff, natural selection of genetic variation, but also it's a story of cultural evolution, cultural change, a story of what our ancestors thought, what they did, how they communicated, how their social lives were structured, and then, even worse, it's a story of how these two things interact with each other in complicated ways. So, how are we to get a handle on this? Well, I think we can draw on the history of natural selection and how it struggled at first, but eventually succeeded, to see how we can go about understanding human evolution in particular. And I guess the argument I'm making is that we will succeed in this by pulling together evidence from many different strands. So we've got the fossil record, but we can twin that with a kind of cultural fossil record in the form of the archaeological record of stone tools and other practices. We've got Darwin's biogeography, and we can twin that in the cultural realm with studies of cultural geography, how cultural practices vary in space. So this is a map of the states of the US, colored by their what's called tightness or looseness, which is a psychological construct. So you've got the kind of ultra-loose West Coast where anything goes, and then the more rule-bound, tight southern states. Where Bateson was studying the nuts and bolts of variation in wild populations, we can also study cultural variations, how innovations arise, like new agricultural practices, how they spread, how they succeed, how they fail, that sort of stuff. Like the population geneticists doing their mathematical work, come around my office anytime, we can do more math. There's always more to do, so that's not a problem. But what about experimental evolution, right? It is neither logistically feasible or ethically desirable to corral populations of humans into things like Dallinger's incubator, right? Trap them somewhere, watch as they survive, reproduce, die, and then you manipulate the conditions and see what happens, right? This is not good in any way, shape, or form. But what I'm going to show then in the final few minutes of this talk is that how we can at least get some approximation of this experimentally and use it to gain insights into human evolution. So myself and some collaborators have built an online platform for cultural and gene culture coevolutionary experimentation. We've called it Dallinger in honor of William Dallinger and his incubators. And this is a platform that lets us do human evolutionary experimentation, but in a kind of a safe and ethically acceptable and logistically feasible method online. So what do I mean? So for decades, well, more than a century now, psychologists have done a range of studies of human behavior, right? So they might get people into the lab, strap them into some machine and watch what happens, or get them to solve questions again and again and again. There's also a pretty rich history of people being arranged into simple networks and observing the kind of very basic cultural evolutionary dynamics that ensue. So for instance, in a transmission chain, the experiment starts by the experimenter teaching someone something, and then they try and teach someone else who teaches someone else. And so it's like a game of telephone. And then you can observe, how that information changes over time to try and understand the kind of biases in the human mind, or maybe you can watch how people improve and refine on the knowledge they get. And the idea is that then you can learn about how cultural change or cultural adaptation occurs. And beyond transmission chains, sometimes you get these little networks where groups of people solve problems together. All of these experiments, though, are typically pretty small in their scale. On the other hand, within evolutionary biology, one of the bread and butter kind of approaches that people use is to do experimental simulations. And these are totally virtual. They're done on computers. You have these populations of simulated agents. You give them AI. They live in a simulated world. They have a simulated genome. They behave according to the algorithms that determine their behavior. Some of them do well and have offspring. Some of them don't do well and don't have offspring. And so that's what's going on here. There's populations that are reproducing and dying and evolving over time. So what Dallinger does is to try to combine these two approaches into a kind of a middle ground. So we recruit large numbers of participants from around the world. They come take part in our online evolutionary simulation. And in many ways, it's just like the theoretical simulation, except whenever an agent in the simulation is making decisions, they get farmed out to a participant who's playing as that agent over the internet. And so here in this picture, the little smiley faces of the participants, they're making decisions on behalf of their agent. That affects their agent's evolutionary fitness, affects how many kids they have. The kids inherit their simulated DNA, and we can also network these participants together over the internet to communicate with each other so we can have cultural evolutionary dynamics. So you might be wondering, well, what does it mean for these agents to have, or these participants to have simulated DNA, right? They have DNA in the real world. It's on the other side of the computer. And obviously, we neither can nor would want to mess around with their DNA. But what we can do is mimic the ability to alter their DNA by altering the stimuli we present to them. So suppose the world we had put them in was some sort of jungle one where the task was to detect and avoid predators, right? And in this case, here's a photo of a tiger stalking someone. We might want to study, for instance, in this context, the evolution of trichromacy, color vision, as most humans have it today. But obviously, not everyone is a trichromat. Many people are colorblind. They're dichromatic, so they've lost one of their visual pigments. Now, we cannot manipulate people's color vision over the internet, right? Their eyes are as they are, but we can manipulate the pictures we show to them as if they were colorblind. So here's an example. This is that exact same image, but run through a filter to mimic red-blind protanopia. As you can see, the tiger is now much harder to see. And I think the better example is up in the top left. There's a couple of little red flowers. And when you apply the filter, they're just totally gone. So for instance, we could use stimuli like this to allow these kind of mimicked color vision pigments to evolve and see what kinds of visual pigmentation evolve under different conditions. If you're spotting red fruit in bushes versus tigers in bushes, you get different sorts of eye pigmentation evolving, and that could potentially tell us something about the selective pressures that shaped human vision. Okay, but what do we actually use this for? So, as I said, human evolution is this story of two kinds of evolutionary processes and their interaction. But culture itself, at some point, evolved, right? There is a genetic basis to the cognitive abilities that facilitate human culture, and it's missing or reduced in other species. So one theory for why humans have the capacity for culture relates to the environment that our ancestors lived in for the past few million years. So this is a graph that shows temperature over the past 6 million years. If you start on the right, between 6 and 4 million years ago, temperature was kind of warm and somewhat stable. But then around 4 million years ago, during the time of the Australopithecines, temperature starts dropping and it becomes increasingly unstable. By 2 million years ago, the time of early Homo, things are getting bad, it's getting colder and colder and getting really unstable. So we get these enormously dramatic swings in temperature. These would have been messing up ecosystems, basically a challenging time to live. And this continues all the way up to the present day until about 10,000 years ago, climates suddenly warm, stabilize, and this is when agriculture emerges. So the suggestion is that this complex, unpredictable environment posed problems that genetic evolution was just not fast enough to keep up with, and so we evolved cultural adaptation to track the environment in a kind of a faster and more responsive way. And so this is how humans knew what food to get, how to get it, where to migrate, what sort of clothes they needed to wear, all that sort of stuff was because their genes weren't telling them what to do. They didn't need to figure things out for themselves. They could rely on complex bodies of knowledge that the communities that they lived in had accumulated. Okay, so this is what we set out to test or explore using an online evolutionary experiment. So we put people in a kind of a virtual world online. They lived in groups of 40. And the challenge we gave them, so the world they lived in was unstable, so it would periodically change. And we gave them a very simple task. And the task was just, are there more blue or yellow dots? So they would get to look at the dots for a couple of seconds, and they would have to say, this picture gives you a sense of what they were up to. I don't know, in this case, maybe there's more yellow. And so periodically during the experiment, the colors would reverse. And so they would need to be responsive to keeping up with this. And they could try to do it themselves. This is quite difficult. But we also gave some of them the genetic capacity for culture, which allowed them to see what other people in their group were up to. So for instance, they might be told that someone else decided there were more blue dots, or down at the bottom, if you can see, they might be told some summary of the whole group that they're in, which is 30 people have decided blue and 10 people have decided yellow, stuff like that. And so then we wired these people together into a big evolutionary experiment. So at the top, there's a generation of 40 people. They would reproduce to have another generation of 40, and this repeated all the way up to 40 generations, so a total of 1,600 participants. We have the flow of culture between generations and the flow of these simulated genes that give you access to culture or not. And then we repeated this 125 times just so we got some reliable sense of the evolutionary dynamics that ensue. So our question was, do people use culture to effectively adapt to sudden changes in the environment that they're living in? And the answer was that they do actually do some pretty clever things to do this. So on the horizontal axis here, this is how long has it been since the environment has changed? And the y-axis shows how many participants were doing what's called critical social learning. Basically, they would learn from their group, they would adopt the local culture, but they would get suspicious, and then they would go out and into the world and look at the dots for themselves, right? Spend their own time and energy trying to figure out what the truth of the matter was. And you can see that there's big spikes in this behavior shortly after the environment changes, and then when the environment's stable, it really tails off. So people are using culture quite strategically, which is during periods of environmental stability, they're using it as a reservoir of adaptive knowledge, but when things change, they actually get skeptical about what their group is doing and figure things out for themselves. Other participants were just contrary, which is they didn't figure things out for themselves, they just did the opposite of what everyone else did. And about 5% of participants just do this all the time, kind of religiously. But you can see, again, there's this spike where after the environment changes, in the next couple of generations, contrariness spikes up in a few groups. And so these participants who are being quite rational, right? They're somehow detecting that the group is maybe not, the consensus if it's blue or yellow isn't as strong as it used to be. So you know what? I'm going to side with the minority, basically. I'm going to be contrary. Maybe the contrarians have got something right. Nonetheless, despite this, so this graph shows the frequency of these simulated genes that gave access to culture over time. There was still big drops in this gene whenever the environment changed, right? So the population, the participants couldn't figure this out themselves, so selection had to kick in and basically force them to turn off culture, at which point they had no choice but to go out into the world and figure things out for themselves. So culture does eventually catch up with the environment, but at least in the aftermath of these sudden changes, there are these kind of cultural crises, and it takes a few generations for people to figure out what's what. And this is facilitated in part by selection, trying to turn off the genetic basis of culture and just force people to think for themselves, because culture has this kind of inertia to it, right? We have our shared practices and we kind of stick with them even when things maybe aren't going so well. So what does this mean for the broad hypothesis about why culture evolved? I mean, it suggests that people are kind of sensitive to the risks that environmental change poses to, cultural living, but at least in our experiments, they weren't perfect at navigating those risks such that there still were these crises. So, no one project ever solves anything. So I think there's definitely scope here for future work to try and think about more factors that might help culture accommodate environmental changes more effectively. Okay, so then just to wrap up, back to Darwin. So as for him, the fossil record and biogeography wasn't enough to see how evolution worked, and he needed input from field naturalists, lab scientists, and mathematicians. I'll argue that we are in the same position with understanding human origins. So if we want to know not just sort of cool facts about humanity or the human evolutionary history, but if you want to put all that together to understand how human evolution works as a process, why we are the way we are, why fossil species are the way we are, then we need to combine all these information sources together, fossil data, archaeological data, field anthropological data, lab work, mathematics on the whiteboard, and every now and again, some data from Dallinger's online incubator. And plug for the IHO, lo and behold, this is exactly the sort of intellectual community that I find myself in. So amongst my colleagues, we've got people who do the field work, who dig things out of the ground, who study humans around the world, who study primates, who study DNA, who do formal theory, who do experimentation. And I think this is really the way that we are going to make serious progress in understanding human evolution in its full complexity. Okay, so I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. I'll thank Tom Griffiths and Jordan Suchow, my collaborators on the work I presented and who helped co-create Dallinger. Thank the Institute for Human Origins here at ASU, and thank you guys once again for listening.